administration has reached an agreement with the Philadelphia 76ers for an arena in Center City.
On July 21st, 2022, 76 DevCorp, the development company helmed by Sixers owners Josh Harris and David Blitzer, in partnership with Philadelphia real estate developer David Edelman, announced their proposal to build an arena on East Market Street in Center City, Philadelphia. Initially projected to cost $1.3 billion, with a promise that demolition and construction would be privately funded, 76 DevCorp promised that the arena would also provide $1.9 billion during the construction phase and $400 million annually in economic output.
The project would add an estimated $472 million in state tax revenue. This would be in addition to the $1 billion that they say will be generated for the city of Philadelphia.
Benefits of choosing this area include jobs and new businesses.
A new study shows a loss of tax revenue if the arena...
report adding fuel to the fight over the proposed Sixers arena impact scenario. Upwards of 170 businesses could close, and the city would lose out on more than $227 million in taxes.
I'm Emily Holloway, and you're listening to UAR Remixed, a podcast companion to the journal Urban Affairs Review. In this 4-part miniseries, we're exploring the trajectory of the contested and ultimately abandoned Sixers Arena project on Market Street in Center City, Philadelphia. In this episode, you'll hear from several academic experts about the actual economic and social impacts of urban stadium and arena development in the U.S. Are these agreements, publicly funded or not, actually good for a city's economy? Do they boost tax revenue and create jobs? And how did developers and consultants come up with these numbers in the first place?
Close to $5 billion in economic activity.
We retained about 800 jobs, but then the construction itself will probably create another 3,000 jobs.
A new study shows a new arena in downtown Milwaukee could mean thousands of new jobs.
Researchers like myself, we're analyzing historic data. So we know a lot about what happens in cities in terms of economic outcomes.
That's Brad Humphreys, a professor of economics at West Virginia State University.
Just for the data that's collected by the government, or sometimes secondary data like traffic or things like that. So economic research takes a perspective that we know when new facilities opened in these cities or when teams moved around. And let's go back and look at what happened before and after those sort of events take place. And that's sort of a natural experiment that economists use. Now, the people that want these subsidies for sports facilities, they take a completely different approach. They forecast what they expect the economic impact will be using a tool called a regional input-output model. And that would do something like take a forecast of, there's going to be 1 million fans that are going to attend baseball games over the course of a season at this new stadium. And you feed that into these input-output models, and it spits out forecasts of what the economic impact would be in terms of direct, indirect, induced impacts on jobs and tax revenues and income. So there are two fundamentally different approaches to understanding what the economic impact is. Now, the issue is that those regional input-output models, we know that that's a really bad tool for analyzing the economic impact of professional sports facilities, but they go ahead and use it anyway because they like the results of those forecasts, which is large, tangible, net new economic impact in the local economy.
So I guess my understanding after digging into studies on the actual economic impacts of these projects is that they don't really create new spending. They just move it.
That's exactly right, Emily. So the peer-reviewed research in the economics and public policy literature is unanimous in that it reports no net new economic benefits. It just, as you said, professional sports facilities and the games that take place in them are really good at concentrating local economic activity in one place in and around the stadium on game day. But that is just, I mean, budget constraints are real. And that's just local spending that would have occurred somewhere else in the city at some other time. And we call that the displacement effect. And that's what's going on. Now, all right, so there is going to be some tourist activity where people are going to come into a city to watch a game. But even there, I mean, cities like Philadelphia, they're big tourist magnets anyway, right? It's a huge tourist destination. I've been to Philadelphia for a vacation. And you know, if somebody goes to Philadelphia to watch a basketball game, they're probably just renting a hotel room and spending money that would have been spent by some other tourist visiting Philadelphia. So even there, and the evidence about the tourism impact of professional sports events is that it's pretty small, right? There's a famous paper that looked at airport arrivals and deboardings in cities that hosted the Super Bowl on the weekend of the Super Bowl and on the same weekend in a year when the Super Bowl wasn't held there, and they're pretty much the same. So, yeah, it's this idea that there's going to be a huge amount of tourism driven by professional sports is not supported by any evidence either.
I also spoke with Arthur Acolin, an associate professor in the Department of Real Estate at the University of Washington. Arthur, the representatives from 76 DevCorps were adamant that the arena project would be 100% privately funded. All of the press we saw during the first 2 years of the proposal and debates, they kept insisting that the taxpayers would not be on the hook for this. But there are other factors at play besides tax subsidies, which are really the most common way that the public ends up footing the bill for these kinds of projects. You know, think about the land that the arena would be on, which is publicly owned and would be leased to the company, or even just the tremendous amount of time that elected officials and city staff spent holding hearings, meeting with constituents, hashing out the terms of the deal. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran a conservative estimate, and they calculated that over $469,000 were spent on an arena that won't even happen. I guess what I'm wondering is, how did teams come up with these claims?
Yeah, and so like historically, municipalities have been very willing to provide really big direct benefits, financial benefits to attract and retain their sports venues. And so in the last 20 years, there's been a shift away from providing direct dollar amount to build and operate sport venues. And so in that context, they are asking for less money or different form of support than some of the previous projects. That's certainly true. But the way it has evolved is that the sport industry is extremely professionalized. They are big businesses making a lot of money, and they are very sophisticated. And so they were still managing to get a lot of indirect resources and benefits in the way the land was being transferred, in the way the property tax was being assessed or not assessed, in the way the different taxes that other businesses would have to pay would have been assessed or not assessed, right? And so their payment in lieu of taxes agreement was a very direct use of public resources that would not have been generated and would have been given away in order to make it attractive for them to move in that location. So if the development would have happened, there would have been huge financial implication for the city of making that development happen. Now that it looks that that project is not happening, as you said, there are many hours of professional city staff that were allocated to that project that are not paid for by the 76ers, and that money, that those salaries, those very highly skilled and good staff in planning, in PIDC and some of the other development organization in the city, they spend their time on that project for 1 year, 18 months. And that was not paid for by the Sixers. They paid for the external consultant that produced the study. They didn't pay for the city resources allocated to review and support the project.
You authored an economic impact report documenting the social and economic risks involved with this project that poked a lot of holes in the Sixers' claims about economic benefits for the community. Can you talk about these impact studies, and especially those that are issued by developers? How accurate do you find them to be?
So like what they try to do, and if they are doing it well, is to have some potential scenario that can inform the decision-making process by giving potential positive and negative if things go well or don't go as planned. And so they're really not a projection, and having like one single numbers generally doesn't really make sense for them, because they are really more of a potential futures exercise. And so in terms of accuracy, there has been quite a bit of work going back to some of the like large sport events like Olympics, for example, because there are several of them. And so you can look at different cities, different experience, and the pre and post comparison on economic benefit, cost and benefits, and showing that costs are systematically underestimated and benefit systematically overestimated. So it's not just that it's hard to predict the future, it's also that the way those studies are structured, the way they are produced, is biased in one clear direction, is making the project look more promising than it really is. And at the time when those studies are produced, you would have community groups or other groups that will come up with different conclusions looking at the existing data. So it's not just an issue of, again, the future being really hard to predict, which it is, but it's also having some incentive and production system that lead to more optimistic scenarios. And then the other one is often not quite presenting that uncertainty about what are the potential scenarios. The fact that you might have a recession in the next 5 or 10 years. You might have a change in working from home or the preference for downtown. And all of those are hard to predict, but you know that just taking the last 10 years is probably not the right way of predicting the next 10 years, that it might be better or worse than that. And it can be hard to communicate and display that uncertainty, but those studies could do a lot better job at that than they do in general. And so taking the work that was done by the consultant on the arena, that's one of those examples. And those consultants were already involved in the convention center in Philadelphia. They have been involved in a lot of different studies for stadium and convention center and other large project. And so they have a track record, and that track record, again, is systematically biased in overestimating the benefit and underestimating the cost. And so if you go back to their projection for the convention center, they were predicting much higher number of events, much larger revenues from that event being generated, much higher occupancy in hotel than what took place. And if you speak to some of the people involved, or even to some people in the city, they would say, oh, but there was 9/11 afterward, or oh, there was a great the global financial crisis afterward. And so there's always something that happened that can plausibly explain why it didn't play out the way they wanted. The redevelopment of the Marketist mall into the fashion district, same thing, very, very positive expectation, including on the amount of tax revenue being generated, the amount of job being generated, and then the reality being much lower. And yes, in that case, the pandemic did happen, and that was in nobody's scenario. But even in the absence of the pandemic, there was probably unrealistic expectation with regard to how successful that redevelopment might be. And so when in our case, when we are trying to do that just piece on what could be the impact on jobs and businesses, what we really just started to start from was what is currently there, how many jobs are there, how many businesses are there, how much payroll are they generating, and what does that translate to in terms of city and state tax revenue. And so like first starting off, what do we know is currently happening, which is a lot easier than predicting the future, is like those businesses are currently in place and generating those jobs and generating those tax revenue. And then in terms of scenario planning for what will happen over the next 30 years or even 35 years, if we take construction plus operation, like if you have a shock, a negative shock that brings them 5% lower, 7.5% lower, or 15% lower than they would otherwise be in the absence of that project, what will be the impact on on jobs, what would be the impact on tax revenue generated, and then just summing up that number. And you can get into a lot of details on whether you bring that into a present value amount, so that you take into account what the cost of money today versus 10 years or 20 years from now is. You can get into a lot of details on trying to break down further which businesses would be most affected, whether some will like stay in existence and just lose some revenue or completely shut down. Like you can do a lot more sophisticated, detailed analysis. That was not our purpose here. Our purpose was just at a high level. If the future looks somewhat worse than what it is right now, what would that mean for the city? What would that mean for the community?
Economic impact studies are generally pretty flawed projections. Usually they say what people needed to hear to get a development project approved. But what guides team owners and organizations to select a new site or project? What are they looking for? Right now, the Sixers share an arena with the Philadelphia Flyers, the city's NHL team. The Wells Fargo Arena is located in South Philadelphia, in the sports complex with Citizens Bank Park, where the Phillies play, and the Lincoln Financial Field, where the Eagles play. The Sixers ownership were seeking full ownership of the arena, something they couldn't achieve at the Wells Fargo Center, which is owned by Comcast and the owner of NBC Broadcasting. I spoke with Joel Maxey, a professor of sports business at Drexel University, to get a better sense of these dynamics over real estate.
Yeah, I think in this case, you have a situation where the Sixers were tenants, and it's in terms of sport franchise value, having a real estate investment is really important to them because it's number one, they don't have to pay rent, but more important to that, it's generally an asset that increases in value over time and quite considerably. So I think the Sixers being in this position where they didn't have an arena, they were tenants, really drove them to want their own arena, an arena that they owned and managed and could generate all the revenue flows that come with that, which are pretty considerable for an NBA arena. And they had I think that they originally proposed one in Penn's Landing area that didn't end up going through. Really, their development over in Camden probably suggests that, yeah, we want real estate and we want real estate development to make this franchise more valuable and a bigger asset, more valuable asset over time. So I think they have had considerable incentive to have their own arena. On the flip side of that, you have Comcast, who actually, besides Chinatown, I think Comcast were adamantly against it from the beginning too. And I remember being approached by them to is there an economic argument against this arena? And I was like, well, for you guys, yes, but so I think that the value of the arena is very important. And the 76ers were, they're one of the few NBA teams that really doesn't have their own, that are in this rent paying situation.
What do you think some of the biggest misconceptions there are about new stadiums, new arenas for cities? What do you wish the public understood about how these dynamics worked, especially with regard to the public finance dimension?
Yeah, I think the biggest misconception that is, to me, people have tried to dispel this over the last 20 or 30 years, but the biggest misconception is that there's this tremendous economic impact that's going to benefit everybody. So it's not just, so we're going to have a new arena. It's going to create jobs, and those jobs are going to create taxes, and it's going to make the city richer. And I think that that's a misconception that there are. I think what really goes on is that there are people who benefit considerably, and often they're the franchises, but there are also levels of related businesses where they benefit considerably, and maybe the tourism industry is part of that, because they're to me, the ones that are always pushing for it the most aggressively are the ones that benefit the most. But that benefit is not evenly spread, and in some cases there's a little cost to everybody. So generally speaking, with these things, they're paid for with taxes one way or another, and so that means everybody's taxes go up a little bit. And maybe they're targeted taxes, so the taxes are on hotels and rental cars. So that argument's always made that, okay, well, that means that out-of-towners are paying for it then, but not really, because if you travel at all, everybody uses hotel taxes. So so you might not stay in a Philly hotel, but when you travel to San Diego or Minneapolis or wherever, your taxes are paying the stadium. Also, hotels who are beneficiaries in a lot of ways are not local companies. So Hilton and Hyatt and all of those mean that the money that's taken in from increased hotel demand flows out. So there's a lot of leakages. I think always employment figures, I just always find those to be kind of wildly exaggerated. Although when there's definitely an increase in construction labor during the building, but when that's over, the jobs that may be extra jobs usually are probably just transferred from the old arena to a new arena in terms of all those people that work inside. And they're not necessarily the highest value jobs. So I think people, I mean, that was one of the things I think in particular from Mayor Parker, like, we're going to create all these new jobs with the arena and Market East, and that's attractive to people. But to me, that's a misconception that ever comes through as predicted.
So taxpayers take a hit for these projects, and these can actually be calculated empirically. But there are other effects on residents that are harder to calculate, but they're just as significant. Economists call these knock-on effects externalities, or the indirect costs and benefits. Environmental factors like air pollution from motor vehicles is a classic example. Car manufacturers, car owners, and oil companies don't pay directly for the cost of air pollution to public health or climate change impacts. Externalities are also evident in large urban development projects. Teams like to cite the positive externalities, like induced employment and business revenue for hotels or parking lots, restaurants, bars. But like we established earlier, this is not new revenue. It's just revenue moving from one sector to another. What about the negative externalities? Things like traffic, for example. That was a major sticking point for the Sixers Arena proposal. I asked Brad Humphreys about that dilemma.
Well, the people that want subsidies for new facilities don't want to hear anything about that, right? But there's a new emerging body of research that tries to look at these externalities, because it's not just concentrating economic activity can also generate, well, both positive and negative externalities. The negative externalities are traffic, crime, trash, noise, those sorts of things, and the associated air pollution that goes along with that additional traffic. And this literature documents a lot of negative externalities. Traffic is worse, and then you can value that because you can estimate the value of time, and you know how much additional time people spend in traffic because of games that don't really need to take place. I just published a paper recently that estimated what the impact of traffic was on New York Yankees games in the Bronx. And, traffic speeds go down and people are sitting a lot more in congestion before the game and after the game. And we can value that time. And we do. And it's not huge, but, it's an externality that wouldn't occur absent a game taking place in a stadium or arena. Now, I've got another paper, so there's some externalities that people don't think about. For example, I've also recently published a paper that shows that seasonal flu transmission is higher in cities with professional sports teams, especially in the NBA and the NHL, which take place during the flu season. And, flu deaths go up, and it's not necessarily people attending the game, but, people go to the game, it increases flu transmission, and then they go home and grandma gets it, and flu fatalities go up. So that's it's just, I'm not saying we shouldn't have professional sports, but I'm just saying that we need to think about all of the negative externalities that occur. Now, there are positive externalities too. Let me make make this clear. There are things about professional sports teams that generate positive externalities in an economy, a sense of community in cities. You're a world-class city if you have professional sports teams in your city, and those have value. And economists have estimated those sort of what we call non-use values using a method called the contingent valuation method, or CVM. So CVM is a survey-based research method, and basically you just ask people, hey, suppose your taxes were going to go up by X dollars, where the X dollars is randomly assigned to people, and that's going to go to support a team in your city. How likely would you be to vote in favor of that tax? And so you can use that to, and absent, the scenarios are really elaborate about what they're telling these people in terms of, your taxes are going to go up, but it's not from going to the game. It's what are the intangibles that you're going to experience because just knowing there's a team in your city. From Pennsylvania perspective, the classic example of a CVM study to estimate the intangibles of professional sports happened in Pittsburgh when the Penguins were in bankruptcy and it wasn't clear that they were going to stay in the city or not. And so there was a CVM study about that, and that's an interesting situation because it was credible that the team might go away. So, and the estimates that came out of that research and other research that's like that are, it's valuable. It's maybe $40 million in present discounted value over the lifetime of 30 years. But that's not the size of the usual subsidy that gets provided for a new sports facility. It's a fraction of that. So those externalities are real, and economists have estimated them, but they just can't justify the usual subsidy that we would see provided to a team owner when a new facility is built with public money.
The projected externalities for the Center City Arena proposal weren't limited to traffic, although that was a major concern for residents and business owners, and particularly the medical community. Jefferson Hospital, one of the only remaining Level 1 trauma centers in the region, and the only one in Center City, is located just a few blocks from the Market East corridor. The projected traffic volume on game days would have been deadly for emergency vehicles. There was also, of course, the projected impact on Chinatown residents and business owners. Not just the game day impacts, but the longer-term effects of rising property values and the likelihood of displacement. We'll get into these dynamics in much greater depth in our next episode.
Leaders are once again looking at making major improvements to the venues, and they come with a major price tag.
To build a new arena in downtown Oklahoma City.
Arena designed specifically for basketball.
The city of San Diego has plans to modernize the sports arena property.
Another issue around stadium and arena financing, especially when taxpayer money is involved, is the increasingly short lifespan of these venues. I spoke with J.C. Bradbury, who has expertise in these areas and is a longtime Atlanta resident.
Right. So if you go back and look at sort of the modern stadiums as we see them today are built out of steel and concrete, reinforced concrete frames, and they're extremely durable. And most of the buildings we visit last quite a long time. So you look at the earliest stadiums that were built. The first year stadium building really was 1909. Where you have Shibe Park right there in Philadelphia, and then Forbes Field in Pittsburgh were really sort of the two main facilities that were built, and they both lasted around 60 years. And so this is the first generation of new stadiums. And yet now today it's more common for stadiums to last only 30 years. And what you saw was that stadiums that were built really through the first half of the 20th century really lasted, 50 years or longer. And you're right. So we have several stadiums that are over 100 years old that come from that era of stadiums. Of course, there's some refurbishments that happen along the way, but it's much cheaper to renovate and refurbish than build a brand new stadium. But what we started seeing is that sort of a replacement cycle that happens every 30 years, particularly for major league venues. And the reason why we see this replacement isn't because these venues are breaking down. But one of the things that team owners noticed was that whenever they open a new stadium, people wanted to come out and see the new stadium. And it's a huge influx of consumer demand that people enjoy going to a new facility because they just want to see, hey, what's the new concourse like? How are the new views? There are a lot more restrooms. The facilities are nicer. So I'm willing to go there and spend more money. But after a while, it becomes kind of stale. And so we call that influx of new interest in a stadium the novelty effect. And the novelty effect is just this increased consumer demand that lasts 5 to 10 years after a new venue opens, in which you see elevated attendance above what you would think would be fans would be running through the turnstiles to that venue. And we account for things like how good the team is and the economic climate. But after about 10 years, it's totally worn off. And so owners say, hey, well, I want a new stadium. Now you might say, well, why don't they build a stadium every 10 years then if it wears off every 10 years? And part of that is that because most stadiums really starting in the middle of the 20th century went from being private stadiums to being public stadiums. I'm referring mostly to baseball here because that's where the history is. It's a little bit different for football, basketball, and hockey, but it corresponds with it somewhat. But let's think about this from a baseball perspective. So you replace Shai Park, which was home to the Athletics and then the Phillies and the Eagles for a little bit. And then you go to Veterans Stadium, which opens in the early 70s, 71, I think. And then in the early 2000s, you have the Phillies and the Eagles say, no, we want our own new separate home. So that it lasts about 30 years. And so how is it that we have one venue last 60 years and another one last 30 years? Well, their lease was up. And so part of that is whenever your lease is up, you're a free agent. So you had a privately owned ballpark. You don't own it. You didn't invest your own resources in it. You say, I'm going to take my team and go elsewhere. And when you tell someone we're going to leave, people in Philly don't like that. But what you say is, look, we're going to get these huge economic benefits from it. And you can lobby your state legislators, lobby your county commissioners, city councilors, and you can get that new stadium. And so it's a lot cheaper. You can have someone else pay for your stadium, so it makes perfect sense. And then again, after the next lease wears off, you can do this. Now, so the reason why we get these 30-year replacement cycle is that 30 years is just the dominant lease. And it's something that wasn't very obvious, but a colleague of mine named Jeff Profiter at University of Colorado, Denver, collected all the lease data. And sure enough, it's 30 years. And so whenever your lease is up, you often see team owners threaten to leave. And when leases are shorter. So for example, in Atlanta, where I am, Turner Field had a 20-year lease on it. And the Atlanta Braves left after 20 years. So when the lease is up, teams like to use that to get out of their current facilities and get nice new ones. And if politicians are willing to oblige, I mean, why not?
The Sixers did play that card. They threatened to move the arena to Camden, New Jersey, right across the river from Philadelphia. New Jersey's governor offered a pretty major tax break package to entice the company to relocate. And this is pretty common. Even casual fans are probably familiar with these kinds of tactics.
With the Oakland A's and the team's future, it looks like the team is on the verge of following the Raiders to Las Vegas, and Oakland's mayor has essentially thrown in the towel and trying to get a deal to build a new waterfront.
Now the team says it's considering other options, including a location in Camden just north of the Ben Franklin Bridge.
In danger of losing their teams to L.A. showed up at NFL hearings this week begging the league not to break their hearts.
After some time passes, there's the threat that, well, if we don't get a new facility, we're going to have to move.
There's Brad Humphreys again.
And that's really the main advantage that team owners have in these negotiations with cities over subsidies is they can always threaten to leave. And here's the interesting thing, I think, from a public policy perspective. Why can team owners threaten to leave? Well, because there's always cities out there that are big enough and capable of supporting a team that don't have one and want one. And why is that? Because our antitrust laws are not applied to professional sports. Baseball has an explicit exemption from antitrust law, which is crazy. But there's implicit exemptions that are extended to other leagues. And that means that there are more cities that could support teams than there are teams, and leagues do that intentionally so they can provide owners with this bargaining leverage. For example, there was no NFL team in Los Angeles the second largest media market in the United States, for 20 years. Why is that? Because it was a strategic decision made by the NFL. And during that 20 years when there was no NFL team in Los Angeles, 17 teams threatened to move to Los Angeles.
So these professional leagues are basically operating like cartels. What can be done to address this? It seems like a legislative question, like antitrust law. But are there other strategies?
For example, it's under the rules of all the pro leagues in the U.S., it's illegal for either a local government or fans to own teams. And I know somebody on the pod is going to say, well, what about Green Bay? Well, yeah, but they're grandfathered in, and second, it's not really the shares that people own in the Packers are not like voting shares where you can vote for a board of directors. It's symbolic, and they are in fact not publicly owned. But anyway, league rules say you can't do this. Their fans or the local government cannot own the team. And in Europe, where they don't subsidize professional sports facilities, fans in Germany, for example, there's called the 50+1 rule, where every team, with a couple of exceptions, must be owned by fan-based organizations that control at least 51% of the team. You know, there's a solution that we allow the leagues to rule out because they only want one or two rich people to own their teams because of the prestige, or I don't know what it is, but they certainly don't want fans owning teams where we could allow that.
All of this research really raised the question for me whether there were any examples of a socially and fiscally responsible approach to stadium and arena development in American cities.
SoFi Stadium is one example, 100% privately financed, and there's a lot of ancillary secondary economic development around that stadium. The Barclays Center in New York City, that was privately financed to a large extent. There's some subsidy, but any new facility that is paid for by the owners who can pay for it is a win, and they should. I mean, we don't subsidize hotels very much, right? In cities, and it would be crazy if the owner of a major hotel a restaurant would say, "Hey, look, I need a new hotel building, and we want you to pay for it because, of course, there's economic benefit in the community of these hotel rooms." That people would laugh that business person out of the room. But sports are different, right? And that's another important thing here, is that sports are tied up in not just an economic, but an emotional attachment to people in cities. Look at the Eagles, right? And that's an important part of the fabric of Philadelphia. And no economist disputes that, right? We know that. But that's why sports are viewed differently, because a new factory is not going to tug at the heartstrings of local residents, like giving something nice to the Eagles or a team or owner or whatever.
Are there any examples of fully private funding where team owners don't rely on local or state tax subsidies to build or improve their stadiums? Is that common? Or at the very least, maybe some examples of stadiums or arenas that were responsible in their spending of taxpayer dollars?
People might point to Baltimore, but I think, again, that's another situation where the taxes on Maryland residents are quite high, even though that area of Baltimore now looks a lot different than it did in the 1980s. I mean, so it certainly had this positive, and I think the city has had a lot of positive reviews from both Camden Yards and the football stadium that's right beside it. So that might be one that comes to mind, but I think, still it ends up being if you want to call it a burden on taxpayers, that it ultimately costs them more than maybe the direct revenue that comes back. But that might be one that comes to mind. I think it may be worth considering, in some arenas are far more privately financed than others. So, and that's one where I would say that that's a problem in Baltimore. I think we're completely funded by the state of Maryland. The San Francisco baseball stadium was privately funded. Even when that happens, there's a lot of public funding that goes into infrastructure and things around it. And that one's, by at least superficial looks at it, really successful and a very nice stadium. I think the new San Francisco Warriors or the Golden State Warriors basketball arena is also privately funded. It's just getting out. So to me, it's probably better when the funding is private rather than public, because it doesn't it at least puts a smaller burden on taxpayers. So there's some example. They're more likely to be privately funded in California right now. They used to be more in the Northeast, but that's kind of changed.
On the next episode, we'll explore the central controversy of the 76ers arena proposal, the impacts of development on Chinatown and emergency medical services in Center City.
Philadelphia's Chinatown section. This time, organizers have announced a coalition.
This is simply a bad idea, and there's one reason: gridlock.
So we have a motto, in the Chinatown movement, we're here to fight the things that our community doesn't want, and we're here to build the things that our community does need.
You've been listening to UAR Remixed, a podcast by the journal Urban Affairs Review. Special thanks to Drexel University and the editors at UAR. Music is by Blue Dot Sessions. This show was mixed and produced by Aidan McLaughlin and written and produced by me, Emily Holloway. You can find us on Blue Sky at urbanaffairsreview.bluesky.social for updates on the journal and the show. Please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.